Thank you, everyone, and welcome to another of our series of the Deep Transformation Network live interactive conversations. And today I'm so thrilled to be in conversation with Four Arrows, also known as Wahinkpe Topa, and Darcia Narvaez. And we're going to be in conversation on the topic of restoring the kinship worldview. And just to give you a heads up of how our session is going to go, we have 75 minutes today, and I'll be in conversation with Four Arrows and Darcia for about half an hour or so, the three of us. But after that, we invite you to join in with your own questions, so this can be a truly interactive experience. And before we begin the conversation, I'd like to take a moment or two just to center ourselves wherever we are, and quite literally to ground ourselves. So please take a breath and consider the ground that's holding you, wherever you're sitting right now. And if you're on territory that's been occupied by force sometime over the past few centuries, then I ask you to really reflect on whose territory it is, who lived here prior to that conquest. For me, I'm here in what's now known as Berkeley, California. This is Ohlone territory, land stolen over the past few centuries from the Ohlone people, who, like so many other peoples, suffered genocide and unspeakable traumas over generations. And yet they're still here today, reclaiming their dignity and their traditions. And if you're on territory that wasn't conquered, then there's a good chance it was home to those who did the conquering. And I invite you to consider the wealth of the area around you and how much of it was built originally on the plundering and violence of those conquests and continues to be based on that to this very day. And from that recognition, I invite you to reflect on the ethical implications of that history and what true reparations might mean for you and your community for the harm that's been done and continues to be done. And I'd suggest that one way to really set the conditions for those reparations is to engage in helping transform the dominant culture to one that recognizes the inherent wisdom of the indigenous cultures that were trampled upon through that history. And so with that, I turn with deep gratitude to Wahinkpe Topa, Four Arrows, and Darcia Narvaez. And they recently came out with this wonderful book, Restoring the Kinship Worldview, which does an amazing job of opening up insights into the Indigenous worldview that are really not readily available to non-Indigenous people. And what I loved most about the book is the light it sheds on Indigenous approaches to a wide range of themes that cover the full experience of living in healthy community. And so that's what I really want to be exploring now in the next half hour or so. And so welcome so much to our network and to this conversation, Four Arrows and Darcia Narvaez. And I would love to just ask you to begin with and each of you comes from different sort of strands of life pathways. Wahinkpe Topa is somebody who's authored, I think, 23 different books and a scholar on Indigenous-based social transformation, scholar in cognitive anthropology, and he's actually had a book written about him by Aaron Fisher called Fearless Engagement of 4 Hours, a true story of an Indigenous-based social transformer. And Darcia is a professor of psychology emerita at the University of Notre Dame. And Darcia I've gotten to know because she has done some incredible research on what she calls the evolved nest, on understanding a true healthy way to raise infants and contrasting that with a modern dominant way of raising infants, which causes such warped personalities to develop. So I'm so curious how your paths actually intertwined and how you came to decide to collaborate on this book together?
Well, I'm going to start. I discovered Four Arrows when I was writing my book on the neurobiology of moral development, evolution, culture, and wisdom. And that book had a mind of its own. It brought me to Indigenous wisdom as the way to get back to proper wellness-informed ways of being and living and growing. And so I found him at a conference. He was presenting, and I was so excited to hear him. And then we started to collaborate on putting a conference and book together. And then later he asked me to join him in this project, which was quite a thrill.
Oh, wow, that's great. So it sounds like the initial conceptions for this project came from from you, Four Arrows. Is that right?
Well, I mean, the initial conception is just anyone who kind of wakes up to realize that the fundamental reason we're in such trouble has to do with the fundamental foundation, which we can call a worldview. And once you see that, then people like you. I mean, I'm so impressed, and thank you so much for your opening. That get it, right? And so I think the first thing that happened was Darcia was editor of the Journal of Moral Education, a guest editor, and she had me publish my story of my near-death experience and a vision that came from that really got me started on all this. Darcia, I think that was before our big conference, right?
Yes, but I found you at the Association for Moral Education conference. I think it was in Missouri. Okay. That's where I discovered you.
Wow, great. And for Arrows, you just mentioned that near-death experience, and I know you describe it in some very profound ways in the book. Do you want to just give a sense to everyone here what that experience was and how that led to a real transformation within you?
Well, I think I can do it within 2 minutes. My family history is that we had a great-grandmother who escaped from the Trail of Tears as a teenager, was adopted by the Caldwell family, a white family, and etc. But no other evidence beyond that, and some photographs of her. And so I was not raised in any sense of indigeneity. And went into the Marine Corps during the Vietnam era and came out with a big chip on my shoulder that I tried to knock off by doing wild horse training, mountain climbing, rock climbing, and whitewater kayaking. So Dave Carr, a fellow firefighter at the time, and myself tried to be the first to ascend the Rio Urique River here in Mexico, and the whole river disappeared into an underground hole when it was my turn to be in front. And I had a near-death experience. The Raramuri people, the Cimarron Indians that still live in the original ways, rescued us. And after the event in a cave with a mountain lion, I had a vision. And the vision was cat fawn, cat standing for something that represents really the phenomenon of hypnosis, and which explains why we're polluting our water and our air. Intelligent people are doing that. And it's called concentration activated transformation, CAT. And how we take 4 of the 40 worldview precepts and look at how the dominant way of understanding it on this continuum between our original nature-based, our indigenous way, or what we call the kinship way, and what's guiding our world today. And that was fear, a fawn, because we also came upon a Raramuri Indian that had run down a deer. They're great runners. I was carrying a baby deer, and that was in my vision. And it turned into the letters FAWN, as mountain lion turned into cat. And that stands for how we understand fear, how we understand authority, how we understand words, and how we understand nature and the differences between how we do it in our dominant worldview and how it was done and is done by the few remaining cultures that still hold on to it. So.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, thanks for sharing that with us, Four Arrows. And something I find so interesting is how each of us, so many of us who are in this space right now sharing this, have had our own paths to come to this kind of shared understanding. And I was curious, Darcia, when you said how originally it was a book that took a life of its own that brought you into that connection with that way of thinking. That's somewhat similar in a way to my own experience there as I was doing my own research and just going deeper and deeper. It sort of began to open my mind into, oh, wow, there's really different ways of understanding things here. But perhaps you can describe the path that led you to this, this greater understanding of Indigenous wisdom as a source.
Well, I've had multiple careers, but my first impulse, heart awakening, was as a child living in other countries where kids my age were on street corners selling gum, dressed in rags, and then coming back to the States, in between those visits abroad, those stays abroad, and seeing the overabundance and the waste and all. And I thought, what is wrong with the world? And I would cry about those children. Now, it took me a while because I had many interests to get back to kind of investigating that. And so I got a PhD in psychology, and people talked about attachment, and its internal working models, and people have these and they carry them along based on early experience. Well, I did more reading and discovered that, hey, it's not just a model in your head, it's actually engraved in your brain. And I found the anthropologist, I found Jaak Panksepp looking at animal science, effective neuroscience, and how important it is. We're very mammalian and our brains are similar, and all the experiments show how important that early experience is. And then I found the anthropologist talking about hunter-gatherer childhoods. And Melvin Connor saying, this is universal all over the world. I wonder, maybe we should investigate whether it's important or not. And I started to put all those pieces together. And the book was supposed to be how early experience matters for neurobiological development and ethics, morality, who you become as an adult. And it turns out that the shaping of the brain, the shaping of our social capacities is what I call now the evolved nest. It's a nested experience. To become fully human, you need to have all these structures in place so that your needs are met as a baby. You stay calm, so you don't get all dysregulated, because so many things are rapidly growing, thousands of synapses a second.
Right.
Systems are setting themselves. And so I was going to write a book about that. And then I realized that for ethics, what do we do then? We got a good brain, but how do we get there? Well, it turns out indigenous ways. I called it primal wisdom in my book. It's indigenous wisdom. How you get there is you meet basic needs in early life, and actually throughout life. We all need to be nested throughout life in order for our cooperative natures to predominate, because otherwise when the stress response kicks in, and we can be already threat reactive from babies being left to cry or left in distress, then we create a brain that's really reactive. But any of us can go into a threat reactive mode. And when you're in that mode, you're not going to be open-hearted, and you're not going to be open-minded. That's just not the way the blood flow is working in your body. So our ethics are neurobiologically based. And that was the thing. And then to get to a place where we are cooperative, that we actually live sustainably like our ancestors. We've been around 6 million years, for heaven's sakes. Right. And then all of a sudden we're destroying ourselves. What happened? And I attribute it to the lack of the evolved nest and nestedness throughout life, primarily.
Right. So profound. And yeah, it's like I get the general sense that they are looking at the evolutionary development of humans and say, we had basically 5.99 million years since we bifurcated from other primates to figure out a way of actually developing our own evolved nest. And then the last 10,000 years, all of a sudden that evolved nest got kind of thrown out. And so how do we get back there? And here we have on the earth today that have not yet been totally destroyed by this dominant culture, this incredible wisdom that has been around and maintained and nurtured in different ways in indigenous groups around. So I really get the logic of that pathway interacting with you two together in this way. And
what happened is that the baseline for trying to get back into balance started after a different worldview emerged. So we've used the philosophies of 5,000 BC or 6,000 BC to begin to try to change things, but it was about 8,000 or 9,000 years BC when we actually left our nature-based worldview.
Yes, exactly. And let's actually turn our attention to worldviews now, because, as I said, I want to get into some detailed specifics of what that indigenous worldview actually means. But I know for Arrows, both you and I write a fair amount about worldviews. I've written a lot about looking at that as a fundamental, how do worldviews shape history, and what's a new ancient interconnected worldview that could actually connect indigenous wisdom with Eastern traditions and other traditions around the world that relates to system sciences. And what modern science actually finds that is scientifically valid and also validates, not that it needs the validation from science, but it really helps for dominant worldview people to recognize, oh, wow, this is actually real scientifically true too. And there's something I love in your book, that you go into the cognitive neuroscience of so many of these precepts and show how it actually works. But do you want to give us just your perspective?
Let's start with what you just said about the cognitive neurosciences. They were a mixed bag for us. I was going to write a book with Greg Cahetti, the preeminent native scientist, who was director of Native Studies at University of New Mexico, Tewa Indian, and a neuroscientist named that was from South Korea. And the three of us got together and said, everybody really is so gaga about neuroscience and neuropsychology. Let's show how neuropsychology proves the wisdom of these precepts that of generosity, courage, fortitude, patience, that are so, a part of the indigenous worldview. But what happened was we had our doctoral students from Fielding, who we were going to be all excited about getting published, who went and got the state-of-the-art science studies on this. Mm-hmm. And what we noted was many of them did exactly what you're suggesting they can do, and that Darcia has found that they do, and I have too, that they do support. But many did not. Mm-hmm. Many said through studies that were done in laboratories, that because a little light lit up in the brain that was the same light where selfishness was, after having somebody do a generosity act, that there is no such thing as altruistic generosity. Generosity is simply a form of selfishness, that you're trying to get something in return. Anyway, and the same thing with honesty. There's been books written on the positives of deception. So Greg and we continued to write the book, but we changed the title to Critical Neurophilosophy. We coined that term that essentially shows how Western scientists look at their science through a Western worldview. And we saw how that happened in the traditions of medicine. That created hierarchies of blacks and Indians being all that stuff. So we've got to be careful with that. Is how I'll start from what you said. From that, I think that the scholarship on worldview has really started out with Kant's idea that it was a deep thing relating to our concept of nature. And most, I think, now say that it is really a life system. And the good work that you've done really captures it, I think, and that it's rooted in a fundamental principle that was derived from a complex of ideas and conceptions about reality that either stemmed from being involved with nature or trying to separate from it. And that's why really essentially, instead of there being, every culture is a worldview, every religion is a worldview, as the religious books on worldviews say, it really gets down to more what Robert Redfield, sort of out of the University of Chicago, the social anthropologist, said. There's really only two. He thought there were three at first: the Eastern, the what he called the metropolitan, which was the Western dominant one, and what he called the primitive. But by 1952, he said that although there's still a lot of important ideas in the Eastern spiritual traditions, that come closer to indigeneity, that largely the systems had become very much a part of what he called the civilized or cosmopolitan one. So ultimately, we're adopting that and saying that fundamentally there's only two worldview, which is a very different idea for most scholars. And, Chesterton said that the question isn't whether the theory of the cosmos affects matters, but whether in the long run anything else does. So we feel it's important. The Institute of Noetic Sciences, based on Edgar Mitchell's amazing vision from the outer space when he looked down on the world, and that only a handful of visionaries understand that in our original worldview lies.
Exactly. Yeah, and what an amazing thing there. That was a quite literal worldview that he had.
Oh, beautifully
to completely transform his understanding. Yeah, and like the way I like to think about the worldview, I think is most helpful is like it's a lens, and in just the same way as we look at the world through a lens in our eye. And in fact, what we now know from ophthalmologists, whatever, is that actually everything is upside down from the way the rays hit the eye but we don't, we create an understanding based on that lens. And similarly with a worldview, if you're not aware there's other worldviews out there, you just think that is reality. You don't even realize, just like a fish swimming in water, that there's something other than that. And that's why this book is so important, because not just that it shows there is another worldview, but, and this is where I want to go now, it actually shows what that actually means in real lived experience. And there's almost so many of the different elements that we take for granted in our society now. Your book shows that almost like turns them over, almost the exact opposite. And so the hardest thing for me was to figure out which, in such a short time, which are the questions to ask you about, whether it's things like conflict resolution or competition or this. So some people will know I used a couple of quotes when I was writing about this event that really struck me as important. But one thing, maybe a place to begin, because it so relates to so many others, is this notion of gift and the gift economy and the contrast between that and what our presumptions are in our dominant market-based economy or whatever. And I love, there's one point, Darcia, where you talk about how in gift economies, the gift isn't considered private property, but things that are always in motion. And so the whole notion of having a gift is that you're not meant to be keeping it, but then sort of making it part of this kind of flow. So do you want to talk maybe a little bit more about that? And then that embellishes, sort of interacts with so many other elements of what the book's about.
Right. So that was Lewis Hyde talking about the gift.
Right.
Who he noticed that they just kept moving things. And anthropologists report that in Native Americans, when the settlers came or explorers came, the explorers noted, well, they took my backpack and then everything was shared. All of a sudden, everything was gone because it's just assumed, everything is shared. And nature works that way, right? There's just a constant gifting of an abundance of acorns or a litter of a million, maybe not a million, 1,000 fish, right?
Yeah.
But that's to feed the rest of the world, right? Not all of them are going to survive, but it's intended to be, cooperative feeding of others, of giving to others. And we are raised that way in the evolved nest in early life. Children are receiving a lot. And Genevieve Vaughn talks about the maternal gift economy as giving unilaterally initially to the baby, since the baby cannot give back yet. So it's based on that nature gift economy that we all appreciate: the sunlight, the air, right? The water. We wouldn't be here without all those gifts.
Yeah. And that then, I'm sort of got this image in my mind of all these things interconnecting with the others, coming from this sort of core source of interconnectedness. And I'm thinking of this notion of security, like in our dominant culture, and almost every one of us, even if our beliefs about it are different, because we're stuck in this economy right now, we think of security as you got to have enough, so that during bad times or when you get old or whatever it might be, you can rely on that. So we want to get, like one of you was saying in the book, like the whole notion is get what you can now as much as possible. But in the Indigenous model, security is almost the exact opposite, isn't it? It's about giving, knowing that they'll flow back to you. And I don't know if 4 Arrows, you want to add.
Well, I mean, even one of the famous quotes out of Christopher Columbus's logbook.
Yeah,
I have it memorized, and it was that these Indians are so naive, he said, and so free with their possessions that no one who has not witnessed it would believe it. Right? When you ask for something, they give it to you without hesitation. And he went on and on and on to talk about that, and then, of course, criticized it and showed that it was a naivety, as he said, that would allow them to make, to be good slaves and to be taken.
Right. Exactly.
Right. But I mean, it is a fundamental precept. And, when you have a chance to show briefly to the audience the 40 precepts, people will all recognize in one way or the other, well, I kind of believe that, or that I've seen that in my religion, or I've seen that in my, but then I've had people say to me that, well, no, we're not in this dominant worldview. I don't get why you say that. I believe that we should be more spiritual. I believe that women should have a higher place. But then I'll just wait, and someone in the group will say, well, what about the systems that you'd work on, right? What about the systems of management and corporations and media and education? And then all of a sudden they go, oh my gosh, that is what is ruling us, because of our inability to put together all of these things that we know in our hearts, but have been taken out of our worldview.
Right. Yes, exactly. Which kind of leads me to think about this other big concept of like responsibility, which I'd like to kind of explore more, because there's a different kind of way, again, of thinking about that than we think of in the dominant culture. But before I say any more, I just want to also give the heads up to people. In a few minutes, we're going to open up this conversation to anybody in the audience right now who has got their own questions or perspective they want to understand from 4 Arrows and Darcia, as to help them think through some of these big issues. So think of your questions as we're talking right now, and be prepared to put your Zoom hand up at the time. And Darcia.
I just put a link to a movie by Rebecca Adamson called Enoughness, and it's a short little movie about the Indigenous economy view. So
thank you, that's great. Yes, because that enoughness seemed to like be crucial in getting that different way of thinking about how we actually think of security and stuff. So yeah, thanks for that, Darcia, that's great. But in fact, a lot of my understanding, the way I've kind of framed a lot of my understanding about the Indigenous worldview came from this wonderful paper, actually, by LaDonna Harris, that I expect you both probably know, where she writes about the 4 R's of indigeneity. And she talks about relationship, responsibility, reciprocity, and redistribution. And as I was looking at the different 28 precepts you're talking about, I kept sort of coming back to those. And to me, it seems like responsibility is a huge one, because when we're talking about things like gift economy or whatever, from the dominant culture's perspective, that almost sounds like we're not even getting close to this thing about responsibility. It's like, okay, you give, you receive, whatever. But responsibility plays such a big part. And I don't know if either of you want to describe more about how that manifests.
Sure. I mean, if you think about how we generally think about gifts from childhood up, it's about, wow, receiving, right? More than it is, wow, I can't wait to give this.
Right.
In the Lakota way, there's a saying that really essentially translates to the highest expression of generosity is courage. Whoa, wait a minute. That's a whole new way of thinking. That brings us into not the emphasis on rights, which come from this idea of gifts, that I have the right to this gift. I have the right to this benefit. I have the right to vote, which has become dominant in the progressive liberal movement of our world under the dominant worldview.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if we understand that a little girl giving away her prized little puppy to another family because they just lost their own somebody or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
this is now moves this up into taking responsibility for the well-being of others. And of course, this is what Darcia writes about in her Evolved Nest, is that responsibility of the community to raise the child is so crucial. And so moving into this idea of reciprocity with the idea that it's the looking at the responsibility to share, and the appreciation that comes from how the world is like that, as opposed to the let's fight for the just the rights. Not that I'm not saying don't fight for rights, but you get my point.
That's so fundamental. Darcia, did you want to add something to that?
The way I look at it is that we're all in a web. We're like a spider on a web. Everything we do is reverberating across systems, across relationships. We're related to everything around us, right? How we treat the tree, the spider, the food that we gather, the plants that we live with, all those things are relationships. And so in my every moment, am I honoring and respecting their livingness, their being, their sentience, their agency? What right do I have to dominate or to, exterminate or, manipulate them? It's a relationship. It goes both ways. It's a coordinated, reciprocal way of being. And what we do when we don't allow children to grow up in their natural human way with all the supports of the nest is you don't develop this receptive intelligence for picking up on the signals, for feeling. And, it's kind of extrasensory outside our 5 typical senses to understand that the tree is communicating, or the plant, or the the animals, and it takes some time to learn to do that again if you haven't grown up with it.
If you haven't grown up with it.
And Darcia, you might sometime in next few minutes in one of the answers to one of our questions from the audience, read the short list, maybe from Robin or something, that talks about this idea of the responsibility, the loving responsibility that is one of our 28 quotes.
The honorable harvest. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And a number of people in this group, of course, have read and loved Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which it has this concept of the honorable harvest, which is so profound. And I just want to add something that I love about this notion of rights. In fact, I think you quoted some point from Sherry Mitchell from the book Sacred Instructions, demanding rights without responsibility creates this warped sense of entitlement. And that is so fundamental to our global dominant economics. And some of you know I'm working on this book to try to distill this vision shared by so many people of an ecological civilization, which incorporates indigenous understanding with different perspectives in economics, science, etc. And a big crucial element of that is looking at the fundamental difference, of our dominant worldview looks at legal rights without responsibility. And so just to imagine what a civilization could look like if it was just understood throughout all elements, whether it's owning real estate, owning property, owning anything, that rights don't come without responsibility, and balancing those two, just how fundamentally that could change things. So that kind of gets our imagination.
You bring into that the idea that it's all about any conflict resolution in litigation.
Right.
It's not about punishment or revenge.
Yes.
Getting your rights back. It's about bringing everybody back into community. Exactly. And so this is why there's this interconnectedness of these moral precepts that stem from looking closely over centuries at nature.
Right, exactly. Which of course relates to another of my favorite topics in your book, which is this whole notion of conflict resolution and these new ideas developing in progressive areas about restorative justice. And here's the tradition that really knows how that works, that you described so well. But I could go on, but I want to kind of open up to others at this point, because I'm looking at the time. So I invite anybody who wants to join in this incredible conversation to if either put your hand up by going to reactions at the bottom of the Zoom thing and raise hand. And if you also have a question but you're not too comfortable being in public and asking in public, feel free to just write the question in the chat and say if you'd rather just it got read out or whatever, so that everyone can feel included. And Jennifer, thanks so much for raising your hand. You, Jennifer, just so you know, was looking at some presentations I gave on ecological civilization on our network the other day, and had questions relating fundamentally to exactly what you're describing. So I'm so glad, Jennifer, to have you here, the first to ask your question.
Thank you. And thank you so much for being here for Eros and Darcia. I'm actually really excited to see you, because you're going to come and speak at a book club that I'm a part of in Nashville in a few weeks. So I will see you again there. But this question is maybe a little bit more relevant for this space, which is, Jeremy's talking a lot about the ecological civilization, and there's a lot of other projects that are going on right now to incorporate Indigenous worldview. It almost seems like it's like a growing trend. So my question is, how do we, I really believe in these solutions as the solutions to a lot of the problems that we have right now. How do we put these to use without continuing to extract from Native communities, right? How do we honor these voices and not fall into the same patterns of urgency and hierarchy that got us here to begin with, and really, really turn the ship in the space of time that we have, which is not a lot?
That's a vital question, and thank you so much for it. For a shortcut, if you just put in, I can put this in the chat box, go to my peer-reviewed article at the University of British Columbia called "The Indigenization Controversy: For Whom, By Whom." One of the great barriers to us doing this is divide and conquer, which is a strategy that has been used against Indigenous people for a long time, from blood quantum to self-identity of the tribe, etc. And half of my brothers and sisters are very against any sharing, even this conversation that we're having now. Half of them are saying, thank you so much for doing it, right? And you have to understand and honor and appreciate the reasons for both. But then you have to take the position that place-based knowledge is something that is unique, and we've got to fight for the sovereignty of people that have it, who speak the languages fluently. That's something we have to do, and that we opened up with. But the worldview belongs to everyone. And Fool's Crow said very strictly, anyone who does not believe that we should be sharing this medicine doesn't know the medicine as it relates to the worldview. So that's the first thing, is we have to have the courage to realize that no matter what we do, somebody's going to nail us for it. A progressive liberal or an Indigenous person is going to say you shouldn't be doing this, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is we've got to do it without that dominant hierarchical urgent. We've got to recognize that, well, let me put it in the way that Václav Havel puts it when he defines hope. He says that that's an illusion, and Sitting Bull was not hopeful. He defines hope as not the certainty of an outcome. We can do this. Let's get on it. We can do this. We can turn things around. And when I first said this to people, they get mad at me. But a lot of activists have thanked me, because they don't burn out now when they think of, hope isn't the certainty of an outcome. It's a certainty that whatever the outcome, what I'm doing is the right thing to do. So sing your songs, do your ceremonies, resist, do whatever, make a better garden, and accept the mysteriousness of our being spirits in a body. We don't talk about spirituality in the academy often enough. And all religions have a piece of this, but if we don't pick and choose, as we do in dominant religions, and we look at nature and how the understandings of people who lived and survived in it, which is our ancestors for 99% of human history, then we can do that with a patience and a sense of fearless courage.
Beautifully said. Thank you. Yeah, Darcia.
There are three aspects to being indigenous or indigeneity. First, we're all indigenous to the earth, right? And so we can all relearn how to be a responsible member of our bio community, honoring the plants and the animals where we are, not smashing the spider or the ants or whatever, but encouraging them, right? We're running out of insects, and that's going to wipe out our species as well. But there's also the Indigenous worldview, which is what we talk about. It's this kind of immersive existence-scape, the way you just kind of assume the world works in terms of being human and being relating to others and relating to the earth and relating to the universe and the cosmos. That's what our book is focused on. But there's a third way of being indigenous, and that is to have the local place-based knowledge of what helps this bio community in this landscape flourish, and how to get along, how to forage, how to respect the animals and the plants there. We're not talking about that in our book, but that's really critical for us to support, because it's the lands controlled by the people with this kind of place-based knowledge on the earth that are preserving the biodiversity. 80% of the biodiversity is in these places. So we have to remember to honor our local, our native people around us, and do everything we can to preserve their well-being and their knowledge and their cultures.
Yeah, wow. Thank you, Darcia. Yeah, great. Well, thank you for that question, Jennifer. And let me ask Charles if you want to share your question.
Thank you so much. Greetings from Zurich, 4 Arrows. It's been a number of years, so great to be here. Thank you, Jeremy, for holding space, and Darcia and 4 Arrows for your wonderful work. So I guess I have a comment and a question, maybe just try to bundle. One is around wisdom and its connection to wholeness. And I look forward to catching up and reading this new work. So separation, or sort of lack of wholeness awareness, has obviously, I mean, that's kind of a core theme. And I just want to kind of offer this lens, which all of that means that collective intelligence, so-called, which is just quite all the rage and a big business, essentially becomes weaponized, intentionally or otherwise. And this is a big part of my journey. And then my question is actually, I'm very keen to check out these precepts and just learn more. And it sounds like they're patterns, and the ones that you mentioned just in passing sounded like they're values. And I'm just wondering, essentially, what's the relation of the precepts to values, and how could that inform sort of collaboration at scale or other ways forward? Thanks.
Well, the precepts are a combination of values, attitudes, behaviors, orientations. It's a whole set. It's a way of being, and so it integrates just a variety of psychology, embodied intelligence, relational and social and emotional intelligences.
The way we came about them was a lot of scholarship that went into it, from descriptions of indigeneity, from first contact to the anthropologist, not like the one in my book on learning the language of conquest that that said that indigenous people were horrible in all these ways. But looking at all of these precepts, and there are more, but these 40 really capture them. And it was so important because the indigenous worldview is considered by scholarship, and this is one of the precepts, a non-binary worldview. And the dominant worldview is considered by most scholars to be so what's really amazing is that many of my most liberal and progressive people won't look at this worldview chart because they see it as a dangerous binary, a rigid duality. Hilary Webb, my colleague and friend who wrote her book on non-duality, is with me on this, saying that we have to look at this as a way for worldviews to finally, because worldview, we hate that. Darcia and I tried every existence scape, all kinds of different words, right? Because it's a European concept. it's not about seeing, it's about being. But coming up with these precepts and not saying that this is good and this is bad, but that this and this are a continuum in which if you don't look at them contextually and holistically, you're going to destroy life systems. And you have to see where you're misdirected in the relevance. So for example, I'm a maid relative, one of the 7 sacred ceremonies of the Oglala Lakota, even though my blood is Cherokee and Irish. And the Lakota, they have been historically a matriarchal, matrilineal, non-hierarchy society, right? So we can have those in the precepts. However, in this continuum, I know that during buffalo hunts, hierarchy came into the picture. Mm-hmm. Leaders were chosen to be in charge and in a hierarchical way of the hunt. Now, for the sake of the community and the food and the clothing that would bring in the safety. And so, but different people were chosen for each hunt to be those leaders. And then when the hunt was over, it went back to a non-hierarchical thing. So if we can look at this as a way to open dialogue, not how it was in the 17th, 18th century of arguing this is the right way and this is the wrong way, I think it gets to the holism, Charles, that I know that is so important to.
Wow. Yeah, thanks. There's a profound question. And over to you, Elizabeth, and welcome to our community today, Elizabeth.
Unmute here. Aloha mai kako. Greetings to all in the native Hawaiian language. I'm talking to you from Hawaii. I grew up in Haudenosaunee territory in the Hudson River. And the banks of the Hudson River mud are still between my toes, I think. Even though I'm 86 now. It's wonderful to hear some old friends mentioned here, like Greg Kahete, who Greg and I were both among the co-founders of the Worldwide Indigenous Science Network. And also, Darcia, you mentioned Genevieve Vaughn, another old friend with many conversations back then. My question is about the Haudenosaunee culture, what the Europeans ended up calling the Iroquois. So many people know it that way. We hear so much about democracy these days, and democracy is supposed to be ruled by and for the people kind of thing. And we know that Ben Franklin spent a lot of time with the Haudenosaunee people and tried to convince his fellow forefathers writing the Constitution to incorporate more of their great law of peace. And of course, the only thing they did take on was the tripartite government of checks and balances, but they left out women, children, nature, and the future, and a few other important issues. So my question to you, Foros and Darcia, I think it's probably really important for us to talk a lot make Indigenous culture really relevant today by pointing out that the Haudenosaunee are the only people who ever really practiced what we call a democracy. Mm. And, it was invented in Greece, but it has some flaws, and it certainly has big flaws in the way we practice it, but they actually had all of it there. And so what do you think about how we can get this out to make it really relevant to people? You know what we want has already been done. It's like right there for us to look at.
Right, it's the baseline. It's not the one we've been using. And I'm so honored for you to be on this call, because I've always honored your work, as has my co-author Greg. But to answer your question, in my book Unlearning the Language of Conquest, the title of Bruce Johansson, and Bruce's work, about trying to say why it's been so difficult to establish this truth that there was no other model for democracy besides kingdoms and queendoms, right? But listen to the title of the chapter that he put in my book. It's Adventures in Denial, Ideological Resistance to the Idea that the Iroquois helped shape American democracy. Bruce Johansson, that was 2008. And it was essential to have that. But everything has been done. I mean, today, even in the most progressive academies, indigeneity is put down. Graeber and Wingrove's new book, The Dawn of Everything, they say that even the European Enlightenment was about those slaves that started to speak in Europe so eloquently, and the first contact reports, like those that helped me design the precepts, there's no way that there was going to be credit given to those savages. Even Abraham Maslow, it's been coming out in the last few years. He spent 6 weeks with the Blackfoot, realizing that his theories were upside down.
Right.
That what he was saying rarely is on the top, rarely ever achieved on the top. Self-actualization happened at birth, and their goals was just to perpetuate that in the culture, even in this prison camp, right? But he said, and near his death, he admitted that he did not share that because he didn't want to be rejected. That's continuing to happen now, and this is why we wrote this book on anti-Indianism in the world. So it's a great point, and like someone else said, there is an awakening that's happening. There is an awakening that's saying, whoa, wait a minute, maybe this fundamental way we see the world is the problem after all. And is it going to be too late? Well, my perspective on it is I'm doing this to help rebuild.
Right.
I'm glad.
Exactly. Elizabeth, you were going to say?
I'm just going to say I'm glad that you mentioned that book, The Dawn of Everything, because it's so wonderful. They, in the very beginning, the way they talk about how many of the Europeans who came over really lived with the Indians, the Native Americans, and learned their language and were able to really have conversations. And that the missionaries, for instance, and the traders for furs and copper and all those, they really understood these cultures, or at least they were reporting back, and the missionaries especially sending the reports to Europe about them. And then people would read them in Europe. The intellectuals started to reading, as you said. That's how the Enlightenment came about, was that people like Rousseau were hearing that the indigenous people of North America were saying, who are you people? You smell bad, you don't bathe, you take things away from each other and from us when we would be happy to give them to you. What kind of culture do you come from? And it got the Europeans thinking about what kind of culture are we?
Exactly.
So I'm so glad you brought that up. Thank
We
you.
have to do, we have
things around, yeah.
but
But
do have to be careful not to romanticize, because that's an equal danger, right?
exactly.
Of course.
Well said for Aras. Thank you for that too. And over to you, Lisa, because I'm aware we have a number of people who have been waiting patiently to share their questions. So I want to make sure we get everyone's voice gets to be heard. So Lisa, we need you to unmute.
Hello. Hi, I'm here from Portland, Oregon, and thank you, everybody. Boy, it's been a painful time, and this is a healing hour.
Yeah.
Or so here. So I'll just come outside.
Lisa, I'm afraid you're breaking up a lot. We're having trouble hearing
getting
you.
too far away from the router. Okay.
It sounds like it, yeah.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So what about sharing this with our larger community?
I just put a link in. There are a lot of other podcasts and videos you can find. If you can't share this one, there are other things at the link I put in, Kindred Media.
Well, I mean, for the people who aren't already reading Wall Kimmerer and aren't already in Jeremy's network and aren't already connected with you people, I mean the greater public. Any thoughts on that?
Well, the argument, of course, is that from the divisions of my brothers and sisters, don't take this into education. Education is where the problem started. Others are saying we have to take it into education. So I believe that courageously, we have to bring this to NPR in spite of censorship. We have to bring this into education in spite of getting fired. We've got to do this everywhere, and we've got to do it with humility and generosity and understanding. But this is something that I've got friends. I just got back from spending time with the Kogi of Colombia, and we're trying to put together sort of, this is our last chance, folks. And saying, we can all do this, right? So that's the big question. How do we get it into? We've got somebody on the call here, Sandra Waddick, who has brought this into business and business education. So we've got to be able to do this.
Yeah.
So wherever you are, you can act you can take up the Indigenous worldview yourself, and wherever you are, and your energy is going to be, you're going to put out the good energy. And then so you are professionally as well. So you bring it in.
Keep doing what I'm doing. Yeah, last night I saw, Amazon at the tipping point. Yes, it's difficult.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yes.
do look at the cat-fawn connection that we talk about in this book as what Michael Fisher calls a dehypnotizing technology. It's simple to use. You can use it at home with any challenges or problems, and people have been writing me letters saying it's transformative. So
I will go and look for your book today. Thank you.
Right. And I guess just to add to your point, Darcia, it even begins earlier than education. It begins with infancy. It begins from before birth and at birth, to really offer a different way of living to create a whole human. So I think that's such an important context.
So we can all reach out wherever we are to connect to others, to honor and respect life wherever it is around us.
Exactly. Thank you. So over to you, Robert.
I'm an ex-professor, and a curious thing happened to me more than 30 years ago on gift economies. Mm-hmm. So I had a young student, probably mid-20s, from Ethiopia. Got her involved in the project, met her mother. They began to talk about where they come from as, an indigenous type culture and a gift culture. Why did they leave Ethiopia? They fled her father because he was going to give her as a bride to another tribe because she was worth 50 cows, which I gather was a huge amount in Ethiopia. And I was just interested in your reaction to that.
Oh, we don't count that a gift economy. So you've got hierarchy going there. You've got patriarchy. These are not the basic principles of our species. They've come more recently, and they are can be destructive generally. 4 Arrows, you're muted.
Rose, I just asked you to unmute. I'm wondering.
You're still muted.
There you go. Yeah, it was saying I wasn't allowed to unmute. Yes, this is a typical thing that I hear. I have 14 Navajo students, all speak the language fluently. All of them are doing dissertations because they all estimate around 70% of the Navajo Nation has lost the ceremonies, has lost the traditional ways, even with the language, has misunderstood. Greg Kahedi says in Native Studies programs, the role of women, for example, has been diminished, even by the people teaching Native Studies. We cannot use the years and years of oppression and genocide and being put into prison camps, and then calling out examples over the last several hundred. There are pockets of indigenous cultures that are still holding on to these ways, like Darcia said, that are real gift economies. What you described is just a form of barter, which is not a gift economy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is so important. I would just add to look at this concept of indigenous or indigeneity oftentimes gets interpreted one sense as basically any group that is related to the land, which includes a lot of patriarchal cultures, which have, there have been thousands of years of patriarchy all around the world, which is a fundamental disconnect with the kind of indigeneity you're describing here, which is coming from our original evolved way of being together as nomadic hunter-gatherers, and how that actually stayed with communities without that hierarchical sort of rise of patriarchy around it. So I think that's really good to make that distinction. Sandra, now 4 hours was mentioning, so glad we get to hear you directly. Welcome, Sandra.
Hi, it's so nice to see you both, and I'm so excited about this conversation. I guess 4 hours started to address the question I had a little bit ago, but in a number of chat, people have been talking about the need to change the sort of the dominant narrative, the dominant story. And really, if we really want to get to systems transformation, I'm just really wondering, what is your sense of how we sort of move this conversation forward? Because this is exactly what we need. And I should say that I've just been, I've become a part of an IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services assessment that's really about system transformation. And so I want to just be able to bring in these ideas as much as possible to our conversation there. So how do we do this in the dominant culture? How do we, and I just want to point out that Charles Blass, who I don't know, just put a note that he has contacts at NPR. If we could get you guys on NPR, that'd be so.
Yeah, we actually were interviewed by NPR about 2 weeks ago, and I just got a letter, about a month ago, and I just got a letter saying that it'll be aired this summer. So that's happened already. And I was censored from NPR 2 months before that, when on Columbus Day, they had me to speak, and they wanted me to send a transcript of some of the things that I would say. And at the very last minute, an hour before, the editor of the program canceled it. And this same thing happened to Noam Chomsky in 1999 with NPR. So our work is cut out. I know that the 100th monkey idea is an idea that probably does not have scholarship behind it. The collective unconsciousness, as Charles was saying, has become a fad. But there's something to it. And all I can say is this has to be a spiritual undertaking. And that means that whether a miracle happens or not, it's always possible with the 100th monkey idea in mind. I was in Japan, and I know the work of Emoto on the messages in the water is challenged rightly and is hard to duplicate. But I saw kids do the experiment, and I hate you, I love you, and the differences in the rice. And if enough of us can continue this, then there's a chance that the post-apocalyptic situation won't look like it does on most of the movies that we see. A white guy with machine gun bullets on his chest dragging a woman by the hair. It instead will look at the work of Jeremy Lent. It'll look at the work of Sandra Waddick and Darcia Narvaez. It's gonna, and someone's gonna go, whoa, wait a minute. We can do this again. And of course, many indigenous cultures, and I've lived with a number of them, believe that we have done this before, we have failed before, and that we have a certain number of opportunities to try it again. So I think going forward with that keeps you from burning out. When you do your best and you look around and see that it's getting worse, and then you get depressed, stay with it. And thank you.
Now, I would add that it's really important to support children and families, because when children's basic needs are not met, when they're sleep trained, for example, a very bad idea for brain development, for social development, when they're left alone and isolated because parents have to go off and do work because we don't have paid parental leave, all that is creating a brain that's going to be oriented to domination and submission. That's what you're doing. And it's really hard to change later. It takes a lot of therapy, a lot of work, friendships and things. So we need to understand how we are shaped is going to create the kind of society that we make out of those people. So let's honor children And then, love them. Every time you see a baby, smile and say hello, and honor the kids in your neighborhood, that kind of thing, so that people can get into their cooperative, calm mindsets and calm their bodies instead of this frantic, self-protective mode that we tend to be in the United States.
And I put in a real brief comment. Remember the hypnosis. What Darcia is talking about is in the first 5 years of childhood, the children are essentially, you can learn all the languages that are being spoken. And that is a foundation. And we can use self-hypnosis to go back and make transformations based on the worldview precepts that make more sense for us and that are on the list, right? And that's what that fawn is about. But this concept of the importance of hypnosis, which has been put down. When Prentice Hall published my book, I was teaching hypnosis at UC Berkeley for MFCC licensure, and I published patient communication for first responders, that during times of fear and stress, all creatures become hypersuggestible to the communication of a perceived trusted authority figure. Mm-hmm. Think about that in Fox News and Donald Trump and whomever, right? And that this is not a Hollywood idea. This is, you can have open heart surgery. I had my appendix removed with self-hypnosis. It's something that's doable by looking at why am I doing what I'm doing? Why am I buying into that? I know better. And what is the way cognitively that I can understand it? And that's what ceremony is. Indigenous people understood this for thousands and thousands of years. They didn't know the word hypnosis. It's what ceremony is.
Beautifully said. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Ways to undo the conditioning that our dominant culture puts on us minute after minute, every day. So to you, over to you, Adrian.
Hi. Thank you so much. I find myself completely sidetracked all the time as the conversation goes in totally other directions. And I think, oh yeah, it's really interesting. I'd now like to ask a question about this. And I need to read your work. So apologies for that. But I'm really fascinated by, particularly I wanted to ask you, Darcia, about the idea of the evolved nest. Because in your little film, which I watched before this, and I was fascinated by the idea of, it reminded me of restrictions I put on my own children, and I'm watching my own grandchildren and seeing bars of cots and so on. But what I was reminded of was Joe Brewer did a conversation with Manda Scott on Accidental Gods and talked about the first 3 years of his daughter's life. Mm-hmm. And what it was really about was very similar themes to the ones you've discussed, but was looking at it almost from the other direction, which was how much he learned by finding a way to spend those 3 years watching his child growing in front of his eyes and learning, and how little of that we do. It's not just about how it's good for them in terms of their development, but how amazing it is for us. And I have grandchildren and I spend a lot of time with them. And one of them is being reared really in line with what you're talking about. And he is the most fascinating and interesting individual who gives me just huge amounts as I watch his interactions with the world. So maybe a little bit about the evolved nest and how that works both ways for you as a parent or a grandparent, and then back again to you from a child.
Oh, yes. So it's so wonderful. The best way to parent is to let the child teach you what he or she needs and wants. If you do that from the beginning, you're going to have a very lovely child. The evolved nest involves soothing perinatal experiences. All the evolved nest components are about, we have science to show how important they are now for creating a cooperative, well-regulated, moral, happy, healthy person. And so it's soothing perinatal experiences. So no separation of mom and baby at birth, no circumcision. It's a welcoming environment, social environment. The baby feels like they matter. Breastfeeding on request for several years. Our immune system needs that. And touch, extensive affectionate touch, pretty much carrying the child around all the time. That's what they want, right? Keeps them happy and calm and creates a vagus nerve that works well, for example. And then there's self-directed play. with multiple age playmates, not the same age group. That's a risk-taking group, right? You're cooperative with kids that are older than you, or people older, and the older like to guide the younger, and it's self-directed. It's not sports, organized sports. That's adult stuff. Multiple adult caregivers who are allo parents and responsive, so responsive to the needs of the baby, keeping baby calm while they're growing so rapidly in early life. So every few minutes, it's a different baby. So the nature nurture is intertwined. You cannot really divorce them. And all sorts of genes are being turned on or off by their experience and for the long term. And then there's nature immersion and nature connection, really important for being a member of the Earth community, to allow babies to be outside in the natural world without interfering in how they're perceiving and sensing things in childhood in general. And then last, the ninth is routine healing practices. So having trance dancing and other ways of getting the beat of life in your body, and learning how to repair dyssynchrony when the baby and the parent don't connect properly. The baby has to learn how to reconnect. So we all need this kind of routine healing practices throughout our lives to keep us into balance, to repair our kind of self-doubt, repair our relationships and with the natural world.
Beautifully.
Well, thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Darcia. I'm so glad we had the chance to hear that in detail. Such profound work, so transformative and so important. So everybody follow up with Darcia's link. And now I am looking at the time, and we're really coming to the end of our 75 minutes. But for those of you who still have your hands up, and unfortunately we're not going to get time for you to ask your question here live in real time. But we are going to put this recording up on the DTN network hopefully within 24, 48 hours. And what I'd encourage you to do is ask your questions, and anybody else who has questions, ask them on that feed in the network, so that both Four Arrows and Darcia can actually answer, and we can keep the conversation going. It doesn't have to finish right here after 75 minutes. So that's the invitation. My apologies if we didn't get to you. But I am looking at it's 2:14, and I do see the Four Arrows just brought something. I don't know if you want to close with that Four Arrows, or otherwise, what I would is that right? Do I have that right? And then I just have a couple of closing remarks.
I saw the smile on your face, and so really briefly, all of you know, I'm sure, what the Trail of Tears was. And that it was certainly as horrible or more so than what we're all experiencing with the pandemic and war and shootings in schools. But every night, the women, whether they were the mothers or people who replaced the mothers who died, sang a song to their children. And the song lyrics, so I'm just going to play the melody. I want you please to tune in deeply. Put yourself into a lower brainwave frequency and imagine the strength and the beauty and the power of someone singing a lullaby that said, "But did you see the beautiful animals in the clouds? Did you see the prairie dances in the grasses when we went by? Did you see the beautiful color of the fish when we went to the brook? And did you hear the songs of the mockingbird, etc.?" That nature is still keeping its responsibility as best it can, despite our mistakes. And the beauty is still there, and the teachings are still there. So maybe this will be like a movie. You can just sign us off as you go.
Wow, what a way to say farewell to Four Arrows. And thank you to all who shared the energy and excitement and really wonderful, positive sense of what's possible that arose from this conversation today. And just as we close right now, I just wanted to remind everyone that next Tuesday, actually exactly the same time as today, that 1 p.m. Pacific, next Tuesday is our monthly live network meeting. And for those who haven't signed up yet, go to the event on the network to sign up for it. It's going to be a new format of a teach-in. And after I've done a couple of brief interviews with network members, Christina Conklin, one of our founding members of the network, will be giving us an update about the state of the oceans, which, as many of you know, is actually a devastating state with tipping points looming. And Christina is co-author of a book that came out last year called The Atlas of Disappearing Places. Incredible title. Our coast and the oceans in the climate crisis. And when I read that book, I felt if the oceans could speak for themselves, they'd be writing this book with Christina. And she's going to take us through what is happening in the oceans. We're going to have breakout groups, as we always do in our monthly network meetings, and then a full-on discussion. So I hope you'll be joining us there. And thank you, Darcia. Thank you, Four Arrows, for really enriching us. What a gift. And I just hope that we can all take that gift in exactly that way you're describing and be passing it on through our own communities. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy, for your wonderful leadership and your big heart and big mind.
Okay. Bye.